ask Patricia, if people join us, I'm just going to put them in. Tricia, whenever you're ready to get started. And if y'all want to introduce yourself, you, Sarah, you want to start?
Sure. I'm Sarah.
Good to have you back, Sarah.
Thank you.
Diane?
Appreciate that.
I'm Diane. Nice to meet you, Patricia.
Hi,
Thanks for
Diane.
coming.
Nice to meet you too.
Mina?
I'm Mina. Nice
Not
to
already.
Yeah.
And I'm Olympia Patricia. I am from San Rosa de Limas, and I
Yes,
remember you. So nice to
yes,
see you
yes,
again.
yes. Nice to see you again.
And
Olympia
hi,
is my coworker.
and hi to Janina, who is on the phone.
Janina,
I'm also on Zoom.
Oh,
I mean, I'm on my computer.
do you have a camera, Janina?
I
I do.
Because is your video on? If you go to the left bottom,
Okay.
left bottom, it says, oh, I think we see you.
There you are. Hello. Hello.
So now I'm excited.
Let me. Oh, hi, Bunny.
Hi.
Now I like to see people.
Me too. I
Okay.
do too. Makes it so much nicer.
So without further ado, Patricia Cuff.
Well, thank you very much for being here today. And I'm going to talk about something that is not only important, but timely. We are there. And today we're celebrating an auspicious day. We're celebrating, this is not the auspicious day. 100 years ago today, the Senate had already passed the Suffrage Amendment on June 4th, 1919. Today was the celebration of August 18th, 1920, on which American history was changed by a curious set of circumstances. So let me tell you that story. The amendment had been ratified. It had been passed on June 4th. It had to be ratified by 36 states, 3/4 of the 48 states we had at that time. 35 states had ratified it, 13 to go. We only needed one. 1 out of 13, the odds are great. I mean, what's to worry about? Well, there was quite a bit to worry about because 8 of those states were southern states, and the southern states were just anti-suffrage. All right, well, there were 5 remaining states, and that's not bad, 1 out of 5. Well, there was 2 New England states, Connecticut and Vermont, and both of those governors were anti-suffragist. So now we're down to 3. And those 3 states are Delaware, Louisiana, and Tennessee. Delaware, that's the one of choice. Unfortunately, Delaware shares the Delmarva Peninsula with Virginia and Maryland, and they were both anti-suffragist. So they were down, Delaware turned it down. 2 states, Louisiana and Tennessee. Poor choice, both southern states. Despite himself, the Governor Roberts of Tennessee had to call a legislative session. And that legislative session began August 13th. In the course of that session, the motion was made to table the ratification of the amendment. That was turned down. It wasn't enacted because it was an even vote. So it came down on August 18th to the final aye or nay vote. And that vote was decided by just 1 vote. A young man, 24-year-old representative from Moose Creek, Tennessee, a violently anti-suffragist community. Harry Byrne was representing that community. And the vote count was called I, nay, nay, nay. And in a little tiny quavery voice, Harry Burns said, I. Everyone was aghast. He had caused the amendment to be approved. Now, if you were able to peek into Harry Burns' pocket, you would see a note. And the note read, "Dear son, hurrah and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them waiting. Your mother, Feb Byrne." Curiously, the whole situation, 72 years of suffrage strife, came down to a 24-year-old man who had the good sense to listen to his mother. He had, unfortunately, he generated a lot of animosity. He had to sneak out, he had to get out a window. He had to skinny along the edge, and he spent his next day hidden in the library. So anyway, that's the story. That's what we're celebrating today, the very specific fact that that happened. Now, currently, there is an enormous amount of information out there. I don't know if you're aware of it, but everyone is talking about this year's centennial. And I've been noticing that in the material that's out there, the New York Times did a whole section, the Washington Post did a whole section. Both of those newspapers paid a lot of attention to the suffrage struggle. And they concentrated on very important aspects of the struggle. Sometimes they concentrated on an aspect that might be a little bit more sensational. One of the things, one of the Post spoke about was the fact that in 1776, there was one state that allowed women to vote, and that was New Jersey. When they came into the Union, they probably didn't realize what they had done, but they quick figured it out and eliminated women. But that's the sort of information, that's just an example of the information that's out there. It's good. It's all very important. They concentrate on the contribution of the Black suffragettes. It's all important, but one thing that you are going to hear today that, as far as I have seen, is not even mentioned in the literature today. And that's the contribution that was made by the American suffragists and the ordeal to which they were subjected. That's the story I'm telling today. So we might, and you know, in looking at that situation, I don't quite understand why we don't hear about those women, those very, I mean, by the time I'm finished with my story, you will agree that these were extremely brave women. I don't know why, but I'll tell you what, the nitty gritty of the suffrage struggle was gritty. It was not pretty. The women were treated in ways that were inhuman and cruel by an administration who knew what was going on and closed his eyes to it. So maybe, I don't know why, but for whatever reason, I'm going to tell you stories today that you won't find currently in the literature. To the extent possible, I'm going to fill in all the facts, but there's so many facts that I won't be able to really explain in this situation. If you have questions, I have no problem with your raising your hand or the chat room. We will have a Q&A at the end. So things you might want to think about in the course of it is the place of money in politics. A lot of these questions that they had then are questions that are prevalent today. So you might be thinking along those lines. You might be thinking about the situation, the bias that occurred in that time period, and the ways that the Black community at that time developed their own suffrage response. These are the things you might be thinking about in the course of our conversation. So you might be thinking along those lines. You might be thinking about, am I echoing? Okay, so I'm preaching to the choir probably. You probably know a great deal already about the women's suffrage struggle. And it began probably back in 1848 with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And that they were very disappointed in the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment allowed all citizens the right to vote. Wouldn't you think that citizens included women? No, I mean, silly us. But what it did do was point out to Susan B. Anthony that since the Constitution is the source of a woman's or anyone's right to vote, they had to have a constitutional amendment which would specifically give women, or it couldn't discriminate on the basis of sex. So that was her thrust, and that was picked up as the mantra of the Suffrage Amendment. So bear that in mind. They are looking, that is the reason why they were adamant about a constitutional amendment. Fast forward to England in 1900. There was a woman in England named Emmeline Pankhurst. She was a beautiful woman with 3 beautiful daughters, and she was an avowed and unscrupulous militant. However, Emily always dressed well. If you see the pictures of the suffragettes, they have nice hats, they have nice skirts. And the reason was that at that time, to be considered in any way other than feminine would be absolutely unacceptable. So when Emmeline would go and throw bricks through windows, when she would throw ink at the bobbies, when she would even slap a bobby in the face, she was always dressed well. Now, she was in charge of what they called the suffragettes. And that's a distinction that so many people seem to be unable to make. Suffragette was considered a disparaging term, and the suffragettes said, okay, you want to call us suffragettes? We'll be suffragettes. That's good enough for us. She arranged a lot of demonstrations, and in the course of her recruiting, she managed to enchant 2 American women. These 2 American women happened to find each other after a demonstration. The demonstrators were treated very, very badly. They used to wear extra clothes because they knew their clothes were going to be torn off them. And so after a demonstration in the Cannon Row station, a woman, an American woman, found another American woman with a little American pin on her shoulder, what was left of her shirt. She went over and introduced herself. Her name was Alice Paul. And the woman responded that she was Lucy Burns. And they were both here. They were both ardent advocates of the suffragists. They were an unusual couple. This couple that was destined to be the most influential of the suffragists in America. Lucy Paul was a tall, well-built redhead, flaming red hair. She was an adamant suffragist, but she was also very devoted to her family back in Brooklyn. Alice Paul was not so big, a little bit more quiet, but a most determined woman. She had one goal in mind, and that was suffragism. The women got together, and Emmeline Pankhurst recognized talent when she saw it. So she, at one time, took them up to Scotland. And there was to be a meeting at the Guildhall of Prime Minister Lord Crewe. So that day, early in the morning, the charwomen lined up at the Guildhall with buckets and brooms, and they were to go in and they were to clean the Guildhall before the Prime Minister spoke. And these two bedraggled women came in, their hair all a mess, their brooms well used, their buckets sloppy. And they came in and they passed the guard because they were looking for these suffragettes. They knew they were going to try to sneak in. And they passed the guard. And instead of house cleaning, they hid under a bench all day. An evening when just as the Prime Minister was about to speak, a rising young politician arrived on the scene, and his name was Winston Churchill. At that same time arrived on the scene a tall, good-looking, red-headed woman, and she was escorted by a very handsome young man. They were just the most delightful couple. They fit in so well. And just as Winston Churchill arrived, this redhead walked up to him, waved a little suffrage flag under his head, and said, "How can you eat here tonight while women are starving in prison?" Well, immediately they were ejected from the scene. We all know who they were. That was Lucy Burns and a friend. But at the same time, the two women that were hidden under the bench sneaked out and went upstairs to the balcony. And just as the evening was commencing, when the noise got loud, one of the women took off her shoe, threw it through the window, it landed on the ground, and they were shouting, "Votes for women, votes for women." Well, they too got escorted. But Alice Paul and Amelia Brown were taken to the infamous Holloway prison. Now, the MO, the modus operandi of Emmeline was simple. You get arrested. That's why she would slap a bobby. One time she slapped the bobby and he said, "I know what you want to do. You want to get arrested." And she said, "That's right." She slapped him again. He said, "Okay, you're arrested." But the idea was you got arrested, you went to jail, and you went on a hunger strike. And when you were at the point of death from the hunger strike, the authorities would be so embarrassed at the bad publicity that they would release you from jail. So when Alice Paul went to the infamous Holloway prison, she did just that. She went on a hunger strike. And for the next 55 days, the authorities at the prison were determined that she was not going to die and be released on their time. It wasn't look like she was dying. They would force feed her. Now, the force feeding process is dreadful. Without getting too specific, you can imagine what it might be like to have a tube forced up your nose and eggs and milk forced through the tube into your stomach. And the fact that sometimes the tube didn't quite reach the mark. One time it came out through Alice Paul's mouth and she just bit it. It was, when I said that it was gritty, it was. And you can begin to understand that. After 55 days of being force-fed twice a day, Alice Paul was finally released. And that was the year 1900. And the Pankhursts were very good about helping their people recuperate. And she was sent to, they had some very wealthy and landowners. And so she went and recuperated. But at that point, she left for America. She was going to come home and become a respectable person. She was going to be, there weren't that many jobs open to women, so she would probably be a school teacher. She left, Lucy stayed. In 1902, Lucy decided that she was looking across the pond and she was saying, those American suffragists are going nowhere, which they weren't. The original Susan B. Anthony group, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, was dying on the vine. And Lucy said, I'm an American. I'm going to go home and I'm going to, I'm going to make that happen, which is interesting that she felt that she was going to be that instrumental. She was going to go home and she was going to shape everything up. And actually, that's kind of what she did. So In 1902, Lucy and Alice rejoined. Now they had 2 items on their agenda. First item was a constitutional amendment. As we said, they knew that that's the only way women could get the vote. The second item was something they learned from Emmeline Pankhurst. Emmeline said, you hold the party that's in power responsible. So for Lucy and Alice, if the Democratic Party was in power and was not doing the suffragist agenda, they would hold them responsible and they would support the opposite party. So these are their 2 items. These are the 2 items that motivated them. So they came home to what was called a perfect storm. I'll give you a little insight into the tenor of the times. There was an item that Susan B. Anthony described as, she said, I believe it has done more to emancipate women than any other thing in the world. Susan B. Anthony in the year 1900. And these are your choices. You raise your hand. The choices are bicycles or bloomers have done more to emancipate women. So if you think it's bicycles, raise your hand. If you think it's bloomers, raise your hand. Those who raised their hand for bicycles were right. Susan B. Anthony felt that the bicycle was the instrument that saved women. But there were other items that saved women. For one thing, there was electricity. Women now were somewhat relieved of the chores of everyday housekeeping by electricity. They had electric stoves, they had electric lights, and they even had electricity that allowed them to vacuum their homes. And the vacuuming was a kind of an interesting method. What you would do is you'd open your window and a truck would come by with a long hose and stick the hose through the window of your house and vacuum your house. So you were free then to go outside the house. So yeah, so there were another factor that entered into the picture was education for women.
Yeah.
Women were becoming more and more able to go to colleges. Oberlin College was the first college that was opened in 1833. And they did the most amazing thing. They allowed men and women both to go to school at the same time. And guess what? They allowed Black people into their college. So this is an opening. This is an opening. And women are taking advantage of that. Now, another invention, so to speak, which is really going to influence women is the typewriter. And the typewriter at that time, 94.9% of the women, of the typists are women. And at that time, 7.8 million women are working outside the house. This is an amazing situation. Women now not only can get on their bikes and ride away, but they can also support themselves. So women, this is the atmosphere to which Lucy and Alice returned in 1902. They joined the National Women's Suffrage Association. And that association had a different agenda. They wanted suffrage to occur on a state-by-state basis. In other words, this state would encourage suffrage, but Alice said, this is useless. The southern states, only men can vote, and they don't want suffrage anyway. So how are we going to get suffrage for all American women when this state-by-state situation or method just won't work? But this is what the Nassau group had in mind. So Alice and Lucy contrived, with a little bit of machinations, they managed to develop their very own committee. And it was called the Congressional Committee. And they sort of did it under the noses of Carrie Chapman Catt and Anna Shaw, who were running the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or Northside, it's easier to call it that. They were told that they should go to Washington and they should have a demonstration and they should do it on their own. They wouldn't give them any money. They would go and find their own accommodations and have a demonstration. And the only thing they would give them were a list of names. The woman who had owned that, had run that congressional committee prior to them had a budget of $10. She returned change. So you can see that the congressional committee was not functioning. Alice looked at Lucy and Lucy looked at Alice, and they kind of smirked at each other and said, "We got it. We finally got it made." So off they go to Washington. It's December. They have until March to come up with a demonstration. Lucy goes home. I told you Lucy was very devoted to her family in Brooklyn. Lucy goes home. Alice stays. Alice spends Christmas in DC, away from Paulsdale, which is where her family is congregated. Alice, as I said, was extremely single-minded in what she had, her agenda. So Alice goes down the list of people that the names she's been given to, and she finds a curious set of circumstances. The people on the list have either moved away or are dead. Mm-hmm. She didn't have anything to work with. So she went to Elizabeth Kent, who was the woman who had been the former chairman of the Congressional Committee. And Elizabeth Kent, even though she had returned money from the $10 budget she had, was very sympathetic. And she also was very rich. And she was able to connect Alice to a lot of wealthy sympathizers. Alice planned a parade, a march, and that march ultimately cost $14,000. At the time when a loaf of bread probably cost 5 cents, she was able to raise $14,000. Lucy came back and they went to work. Now, Alice was determined that she would have a parade on March 3rd, 1913. That was the eve of President Wilson's inauguration. Alice wanted March 3rd. She wanted it down Pennsylvania Avenue. So she went to the police commissioner and said, "I would like March 3rd on Pennsylvania Avenue, thank you." And he said, "No, I'll give you March 6th on Connecticut Avenue." And she said, "No, thank you. I want March 3rd on Pennsylvania Avenue." And he said, "No, I'll give you March 8th on any street you want." She said, "No, thank you. I want March 3rd, 1913. He said, "I'm not going to give you a lot of police. We'll all be over there connecting with the president when he arrives." And no. Now, here's where the connections come in, and we're talking about money and politics. Alice was able to connect with people who had power. And through that connection, she was able to get March 3rd on 1913. So she managed to raise $14,000. And on March 3rd, the parade is ready to go. Now, this is a fantabulous parade. She had people there from outside the country, people demonstrating for women's suffrage, a women's suffrage amendment. Remember, this is the whole purpose for Alice and Lucy. She had bands, she had floats, she had charades, she had tapestries, she had marchers, she had people from their professions dressed in their profession uniforms. Nurses would wear white in those days. She had students in caps and gowns. They would march. And here's where there's an issue with the inclusion of the sorority, the Delta sorority from Howard University. And that's something we can talk about later if you'd like to. But they were also included in a peripheral way. So the march takes off. It's a beautiful day. Everything's in place. The bands are playing. At the head of the march is the Field Marshal, Madam Burleson, and right behind her is the most beautiful suffragist, Inez Milholland. Remember that name, Inez Milholland. She is riding astride, no side saddle for this lady. She's riding aside Gray Dawn, a huge white stallion. Right behind the parade marshal, Inez is in place, ready to take off. The bands are playing, the floats are in place, everything is in order, and they take off and they're marching along. And Ms. Burleson, the woman who is leading the marshal, notices that there's some men on the street. And she didn't think, and then she noticed there were more men on the street. And then the street was inundated with furious men, a lot of them in town for the inauguration, Southerners who had had a bit of a bourbon before they got there. And they simply manhandled the women. They threw cigarette butts at them. They tried to trip them with their canes. They tore their clothing. They tried to mount the floats. The black men who were leading the floats put them down. They tore the women off the floats. They tore the women's clothing. It was a nightmare. Alice Paul commandeered a car, drove through the crowd, and the Inez Milholland on Gray Dawn had no trouble driving the horse right into the crowd. I guess they just learned to get away. But the situation, if you ever see any pictures of it, you wouldn't even know there was a parade. And then of course the police, who were supposed to be keeping order, were more or less sympathizing with the men and said to the women, this wouldn't happen if you stayed home. The only group that was sympathetic to the women was a Boy Scout troop. And they had been asked to attend the parade because rumor had it that there was somebody who was going to throw a lot of mice into the parade line. So the Boy Scouts were there to help out. Well, they waded in and they started using their truncheons to beat back the men. Now, Police Commissioner Sylvester is over at the train station where President Wilson is arriving from Virginia. And President Wilson gets off the train and says, where is everybody? You know, this is my inauguration. Why isn't anyone here? And Sylvester has to say, well, they're over at the parade. And oh, wait a minute, there may be a riot. So finally he calls in the cavalry, and the cavalry comes, and the cavalry invades the parade, clears it, and the parade is allowed to finish. Afterward, the women are just so distressed. They all get together and they are furious about what happened. Take a look at where Alice Paul is. She's back at her desk. She's still wearing her cap and gown that she had worn in the parade. And she is busy alerting all of the newspapers about this tremendous injustice that had taken place. Alice said, there's no such thing as bad publicity. Now everybody in the country knows about the suffrage amendment. So Alice was not unhappy. Obviously, she wasn't pleased, but she was not unhappy because this parade, the response to the parade, had provoked such an uproar that she had enormous amounts of publicity. The Congress was pressured into looking into what had happened. And after deliberating 10 days with a lot of witnesses, they determined that nobody was responsible. So for the next 3 or 4 years, up until about 1916, the women do the deputations to the president, which is curious at that time, which we would find so hard to imagine now. citizens who wanted to could organize a deputation to the president, and you could sit down and meet with the president. So they would have a lot of deputations to the president. They arranged a lot of these suffrage specialists in which they would have special trains touring the country. They would have women speaking to groups from the back of the train. They would have women speaking to groups from auditoriums. And one woman, remember I told you to remember Inez Milholland. Inez Milholland was enormously charismatic. People loved Inez. And Inez loved to speak. But unfortunately, Inez wasn't very healthy. In the middle of one of her dissertations, Inez collapsed. And she went off the stage, took a few minutes to recover, and came back and finished her deputation. Unfortunately, that was her last. Inez went into the hospital. She was suffering from pernicious anemia. She was so terribly sick that they couldn't even operate on her for obvious problems. And Inez passed away. Now, the sad event of Inez's death was incalculable. However, it gave the suffrage movement a martyr. They celebrated Inez's death on Christmas at a huge event. She was on celebration. She was celebrated at the Rotunda, the Capitol Rotunda, with a wonderful tribute. So the next day, in January 9th, a deputation went to the president, and they wanted to present President Wilson with the Milholland memorials. And they had a group of 300 women that went to see him. Well, when President Wilson saw 300 women, he said, I was only supposed to speak to one. They said, all right, here's one. And Sarah Bardfield was another woman whose name should be remembered, spoke to him and said, President Wilson, will you please speak up for the Anthony Amendment? And he said, there's nothing I can do to help you. I'm absolutely helpless. I can only do what my Democratic Party wants me to do. Now, remember, I told you they're going to hold the party in power responsible. And with that, he got up, walked off the stage, and closed the door. The women went back to the Cameron House where they were headquartered. And Harriet Stanton, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter, Harriet Stanton Blanche, gathered the women together and said, listen, ladies, we have done everything we could. We have had deputations, we've had train rides, we have done everything. We now have to be sentinels. Now, Alice Ball is listening. Sentinels, eh? The next day, 11 women set a trail across Lafayette Park to the White House, and the silent sentinels were born. And for the next 12 months, women stood in front of the White House with signs attesting to the fact that women did not have the vote. Now, what happened was the reaction to the women was not always very good. And there was a lot of publicity about it. Now, fast forward, the women's banners get more and more controversial. At one point, they compared President Wilson to the Kaiser, the German Kaiser, with whom we were then at that point having issues. And another time, they displayed a Russian banner as the Russian envoy was coming in to visit with President Wilson. They stood outside with a Russian banner that said, he advocates for democracy in Russia, but we don't have democracy here. It's getting more and more publicity, more and more adverse reaction, and it is getting more and more under President Wilson's skin. And he decides it's time to start arresting these individuals. So now the women are arrested and put into jail. Now, this happened several times, and there's information out there in the various books, including mine, about what exactly took place. I'm just going to tell you about one in particular. And this is the event that took place on November 4th, 1917. I'm sorry, that's November 14th, 1917. The horrendous night of terror at the Aquacon prison. They were arrested and taken to the district jail. They were forced to spend the night there on November 13th. Judge Maloney, who had had his fill of these suffragists, particularly that ringleader, that red-headed ringleader, and he said, these are your sentences. 6 days for Mary Nolan, who was 73 years old. 60 days for the average person. 6 months for that red-headed ringleader. We will send you to, oh no, we won't send you to the district jail because there's somebody who's already been arrested and is over in the district jail and is on a hunger strike. And her name is Alice Paul. We don't want all you people together inspiring each other. So you people go to the Aquacon Workhouse. Now the Aquacon Workhouse is a story in itself. It was originally a well-meaning endeavor. But by then it had deteriorated under the hand of Commissioner Warden Raymond Whitaker, who, as described in one of the books, was a sweaty, beady-eyed man with a huge birthmark over his eye. In addition to being unpleasant to look at, he was an extremely unpleasant individual. And the night of terror was truly a night of terror. The women were manhandled, they were dragged around. Mary Nolan records the fact, Doris Stevens records the fact that Mary Nolan was dragged. She was saying, I have a bad foot, I'll walk. And they dragged her. They threw them into cells, 3 in the cell, with one cot with a dirty blanket on it. They jailed them in the men's prison, which was a hellhole, where they had previously incarcerated the most incorrigibles, and it was just a hellhole. Lucy Burns is in there, and so she's saying, Mary, are you, she's talking at a cell door. Mary, are you all right? How is your foot? Phoebe, Dora, how are you? How are you? And a guard comes over, takes her arms and manacles them to the bars above her head and left her hanging there. Julia Emery is opposite Lucy and says to Lucy, I will hang as long as you do, Lucy. And she put up her bars and she hung as long as Lucy hung. Finally, when the evening went on, a kinder guard came along and cut Lucy down. So what is Lucy's reaction? Hunger strike, hunger strike. All the women went on a hunger strike. They said, we've got to get that instigator out of here. So they put her over in the district jail to force feed her. Now, Alice Paul is already in the district jail. And her treatment by Dr. Gannon, who was a sadist, was unbelievable. He tried very hard to have her committed to a psychiatric hospital for life. When he wasn't able to do that, he put her into the psychiatric ward of the prison. And furthermore, had a light shined in her face every hour to make certain she was okay, so she could get no sleep. It went on and on. There were 2 men who were sympathetic. One was involved in the clandestine relationship with one of the suffragists, so he was motivated. But he happened to be a man of prestige and power, and his friend, a lawyer, who were able to trick Whitaker into a trial. They held a trial and the women came in, they couldn't stand up. They were on hunger strikes. They were just decrepit. They were on the point of death. There's a picture of Mary Nolan and she is just falling down. The press was so horrendous. And the question was, would these women even live? That finally they were all released from prison. Did they quit? No. Why should they quit? So they all went back, recovered, and began another campaign. And that campaign had to do with burning in the park at the Lafayette statue urns they called fires for freedom. And they would burn their fires for freedom, and they would be, sometimes they would be even supported by passersby. Sometimes they would even be given money. But what happened was, time was coming slow. Time was coming short for the passage of the amendment. It had to be done by the Senate by a certain time. Alice says, we got to up the ante here. We got to do more. So they did the most outrageous thing they could think of. They burnt President Wilson in effigy. Now, the effigy was a 2-foot-high little straw figure. But they got so much publicity, they got jailed and put into jail again. They went on a hunger strike and so on and so on. Finally, with all the pressure and all the timeliness of it, in June 4th, the Senate passed the Anthony Amendment, and then the ratification process took place. So we know about the ratification process. Spoiler alert, the women got the vote.
Yay.
Yay. Yay.
Ooh, hip, hip, hooray.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
I was looking at some of the names and references while you were speaking, looking at the Lucy and Alice's
Burns,
picture and the prison over in Aquacon Work Prison, which is now Lorton. It's an arts center.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So does anybody have any questions?
It's an amazing story.
Very informative.
It's amazing. Thank you very much.
Yes,
I
yes.
would like to have Patricia, whenever we are back open, to come in and, share this story and whatever other stories that she has with more of our members too, when we get back to normal. So
Mhm.
hopefully you can do
Definitely.
that, Patricia. We certainly appreciate your time here and your expertise, your knowledge, and any other questions.
And thanks to Janina for bringing her.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And you might want to know, if you're interested, that she does have a book on Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, and you can go to Amazon and see, and then get a bigger story, because these women were fabulous, but it was a whole coterie of people, a whole host of people. And when Pat comes back, she can give you a broader picture of all the involvement and all the other things that she wasn't able to touch on today, because it's an incredible story.
Definitely check out her book on Amazon, her books.
And you'll find it, Patricia Cuff, if you put in Alice Paul, Patricia Cuff, or Patricia Cuff and Alice Paul, it will come up. It's Alice Paul, a suffragist for today. And when I picked that title, I did it deliberately because the questions I raised initially, the question about money in politics, the question about the Black involvement in the suffragist movement, and it's comparable to the events that are taking place today.
Absolutely.
You're right. Yeah.
And so those issues, I'd be very happy. We didn't have the time today to get deep into those particular issues, but it's ironic, isn't it? Or I don't know, maybe this is just human nature, but it is amazing that the problems we had then exist in some extent today.
Yes.
Absolutely. And we went through the
Nothing's
60s.
changed.
So,
Yes,
Mhm.
I mean, has anybody ever thought about the fact that when they talk about the probabilities of the next election, they always seem to incorporate the amount of money that's being raised by the various candidates.
Right, yeah.
I mean, what do you think of that?
Mhm.
I mean, how do you feel, how does that fit into the picture?
That'll be the next discussion.
Yes.
yes, thank you so much. Let's hear it for Patricia.
Thank you very much.
Yay.
I know.
Don't forget to tune in on Friday for our BGC social at 1 o'clock. We're going to be doing TV, music trivia. And also I'm working on some virtual trips. I've got a really good series on the Louvre once we get that planned. So we're working on some more virtual stuff as well. We are still working on in-person social distancing get together. So maybe in September, we can
Yes.
get together and actually see each other.
That would be nice.
Safe distance, but nevertheless. So we're working on some of that too. So
Very good.
thank you, Patricia. Again, thank you, Jania, for setting this up. And I'm glad we had the right day and time.
That was, yes,
Perfect.
yeah. Uh-huh.
Well, last week we did we had a dental visit, a traveling dentist come, and a lot of people showed up at the wrong location, even though I don't know what happened there, but you got services anyway.
Well, it's a program for seniors, so anything can
Yeah.
happen.
Well, Sarah, it's good to see you back. We missed Diane, we missed Gail last time.
Yeah.
Buongiorno.
All right.
No, no.
And thank you again. We're gonna close it off. Look for the newsletter email for next week, and look at the one for this week from Charlene. And we will be back again on Friday. I hope to see you all on Friday.
Okay, thank you very much,
care.
Jerry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry.
Very much.
Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna end. And
Thank you, Jerry.
anybody else have something to say?
No,
No?
Goodbye.
What are you having for lunch?
I just had lunch. I had a barbecue chicken and a piece of lasagna.
I had Chick-fil-A.
I came from the senior center after teaching my class and working over there. So I came 5 minutes before this session. So I had to sneak to the kitchen quickly.
Well, I have to go pick up my car. I've got new brakes.
Oh, wow.
So I don't have to keep
That's
running
better than
out.
old breaks.
Yeah, I don't have to run into a bit larger objects to stop now.
Yeah.
I just put on brakes. All right, thank you again.
Okay,
Well, have a
goodbye,
good
everybody.
day.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Mina.
Bye.
Bye.
By
Bye-bye.
the way, Olympia, we were streamed live over Facebook.
Ah,
So hopefully our members on Facebook, we asked them to take a look as well.
Great.
So
Thanks.
you were on Facebook, all of you.
Mhm.
Good. Nice to meet
Okay,
you.
good. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.